thing. We got an Eastern Conference Player of the Week.
Clark has won the WNBA Eastern Conference Player of the Week for the third time this season. Third time. And here is the part that makes that number even more remarkable than it already sounds in isolation. Injury has cost her significant stretches of availability this season. Without those missed games, without those periods where she was managing her back injury and operating under a minutes restriction that actively constrained her ability to produce at her actual competitive peak.
When the WNBA announced Caitlin Clark as Eastern Conference Player of the Week for the third time this season, what should have been a straightforward celebration of individual excellence became something far more complicated. The announcement itself was routine. The stats were there, the performances were undeniable, and the award was deserved without question. But in the background, captured on camera for thousands to dissect frame by frame, was something that revealed far more about the Indiana Fever organization than any official statement ever could. An assistant coach's visible reaction to her own players' recognition sparked immediate conversation across every platform where serious basketball discourse happens. And that moment, seemingly insignificant in isolation, became the catalyst for a much larger conversation about what's really happening inside this franchise, as one of its players is constructing the statistical foundation for a legitimate MVP campaign. This isn't just about an award. This is about what happens when individual excellence reaches a certain threshold, and the people surrounding that excellence either celebrate it or reveal something troubling about the culture they've created. The numbers Clark is putting up right now would have one MVP in most years of this league's history. But we're not in most years. We're in a season where institutional preferences, documented biases, and organizational dynamics are all colliding with statistical reality. And nobody's prepared for what that collision is about to reveal. Before we can understand why this Player of the Week announcement matters beyond the immediate recognition, we need to sit with what Caitlin Clark actually accomplished this week and put it into the proper context that separates ordinary excellence from the kind of performance that forces a fundamental reckoning with how we evaluate basketball. The numbers exist in isolation first. 25.7 per game, 53.7% shooting from the field, 9 assists per game, 5 rebounds per game. Those aren't just good numbers. Those are the kind of statistical outputs that define entire careers for most players in this league. They represent the ceiling of what sustained excellence looks like when a player is operating in complete rhythm with her competitive environment, when the preparation meets the moment, and when everything a player has worked for in the offseason converts into actual on-court production. But here's where context becomes not just important, but genuinely necessary for understanding what we're actually watching unfold. Caitlin Clark accomplished all of this while managing a back injury that has cost her significant stretches of playing time throughout this season. That's not an excuse. That's a complicating factor that actually makes the achievement more remarkable when you think about what the full picture reveals. Without those missed games, without the periods where she was operating under minutes restrictions and managing pain that would have sidelined most other players, the total number of Player of the Week awards she would have accumulated this season could be substantially higher than 3. 3 is what she managed despite everything. 3 is what she earned while her body was telling her to do less, and competing in a league that doesn't slow down for injuries or pain management. The shooting percentage deserves its own examination because 53.7% from the field across multiple games against multiple defensive schemes is the kind of efficiency that doesn't happen by accident. That's preparation meeting talent meeting moment. That's a player who understands defensive schemes well enough to exploit them. That's a player who's taking the right shots in the right situations and converting them at rates that make her nearly impossible to defend without specifically game planning for her presence on the court. When you combine that kind of shooting efficiency with 9 assists per game, you're looking at a player who's not just scoring but creating advantages for her teammates. She's not hoarding the basketball. She's orchestrating offense. She's reading defenses and making decisions in real time that multiply her impact, far beyond what the point total reflects. The historical context makes this week even more significant than the raw statistics suggest. Caitlin Clark has already recorded the fastest path to 1,500 career points in WNBA history. She's delivered the first 40-point, 10-assist game this league has ever seen. She's been stacking achievements at a pace that forces the record books to keep adjusting because what she's doing hasn't been done before. And all of that happened before this particular week of production. So when we talk about this Player of the Week award, we're not talking about a player reaching a new peak. We're talking about a player who's already redefined what's possible at her position, maintaining excellence at that redefined level week after week after week. The injury component makes the timing particularly significant because it means we haven't even seen the full version of what Caitlin Clark is capable of producing on a nightly basis. We're watching her operating at a very high level while managing physical constraints that would compromise the performance of virtually every other player in this league.
We need to talk about what is happening with Caitlin Clark's MVP campaign right now, because the numbers she is producing in this second half of the season are making a conversation that certain corners of this league's media ecosystem have been desperately trying to avoid completely and permanently unavoidable.
Imagine what happens when that back is completely healthy. Imagine what those shooting percentages look like when she's not compensating for physical discomfort. Imagine what the assist numbers become when she has complete freedom to operate without thinking about pain management between plays. The version of Caitlin Clark we're watching right now is a constrained version of what her actual ceiling might be. This matters for the MVP conversation in ways that go beyond just adding context to the statistics. MVP voting happens in the moment. It happens based on what players are producing in the specific season where the voting occurs. But it also happens within a framework of how we evaluate excellence, what we consider necessary for individual recognition, and whether we're willing to acknowledge when a player is doing something that genuinely transcends what we've previously considered the standard for excellence in this league. Clark's numbers this week: 25.7, 53.7%, 9 assists, 5 rebounds, exist in a season where she's already broken records that stood for years. She's already established herself as a player operating at a historical level. And she's continuing to produce at that level while managing injury concerns that would legitimately excuse a step backward in production. The Player of the Week award exists to recognize sustained excellence across multiple games and multiple competitive contexts. It's not about one spectacular game against one opponent. It's about proving that what you did last week wasn't a fluke, that you can reproduce excellence consistently, that you're not just capable of performing at an elite level, but that you're performing at that level reliably and repeatedly. Caitlin Clark won Player of the Week for the third time this season because she met that standard. She proved it across multiple games. She did it while shooting efficiently. She did it while creating advantages for her teammates. She did it while managing physical constraints. And everything about this week's accomplishment points directly toward the larger conversation that's been building throughout this season about what her actual ceiling is, and whether the institutional apparatus of this league is prepared to acknowledge it when she reaches it. The MVP conversation in the WNBA isn't abstract. It's not theoretical. It's a direct and specific comparison between the players who are producing at the highest levels in a given season, and right now, that conversation has narrowed to 2 names: Caitlin Clark and A'ja Wilson. Everyone else, Paige Buchers, Olivia Miles, every other player competing at the highest level, has been functionally eliminated from serious consideration at the ballot's highest positions. This is a 2-person race, and understanding what that means requires examining exactly what A'ja Wilson is producing and why Clark's numbers, despite being slightly lower on the surface, are constructing a genuinely competitive and genuinely worthy statistical argument. A'ja Wilson is averaging 32 points, 12 rebounds, and 4.7 assists per game. Those are extraordinary numbers. They are the kind of statistics that in most years of this league's history would produce an uncontested MVP award.
The total number of Player of the Week awards she would have accumulated could be considerably higher than 3. 3 is the documented number. 3 is what she managed, despite everything this season has placed directly in her path. Her numbers this week were 25.7 points per game, 53.7% shooting from the field, 9 assists per game, and 5 rebounds per game.
They represent a player who is legitimately one of the greatest to ever compete in professional basketball, operating at a level that reflects her status as one of the sport's all-time elite competitors. Nobody is making an argument that A'ja Wilson isn't producing at an elite level. The argument is whether Clark's production, which is different in composition but comparable in impact, deserves to be weighed equally in the voting process. Here's where the statistical comparison becomes genuinely interesting from an analytical perspective. Wilson is averaging 32 points per game. Clark is averaging 25.7. That's a difference of approximately 6.3 points per game in Wilson's favor. It's significant, but it's not massive. Wilson is averaging 12 rebounds per game. Clark is averaging 5. That's a 7 rebound difference per game, which is substantial, but also reflects the fact that they're playing different positions with different roles in their respective teams' offensive systems. Wilson is averaging 4.7 assists. Clark is averaging 9. That's a 4.3 assist difference per game in Clark's favor, which is actually quite significant when you start thinking about the volume of playmaking and offensive creation involved. When you step back and look at the complete statistical picture, rather than individual components in isolation, what emerges is not a situation where one player is clearly and unambiguously superior to the other. What emerges is a situation where two different players are producing at elite levels in different ways. Wilson is operating as a dominant offensive force who's scoring at high volume and rebounding at elite rates. Clark is operating as a perimeter playmaker who's creating advantages for her entire offense while maintaining elite shooting efficiency and scoring at levels that would constitute a career year for most other players in this league. The media's role in this comparison becomes critically important because institutional biases have demonstrably shaped how MVP conversations have been resolved in previous seasons. Clark's first professional season provides the clearest example of how this works in practice. She finished 4th in MVP voting while producing numbers that in numerous previous years of this league's history would have won the award without meaningful competition. The voting process was informed by institutional preferences and documented biases that determined the award belonged elsewhere despite statistical evidence that could have reasonably supported her candidacy. That's not speculation. That's a documented pattern that shaped how one of the most important individual awards in professional basketball was distributed. Fast forward to this season, and Clark is operating at an even higher level than she was in her rookie year. Her shooting efficiency is elite. Her assist numbers are historically significant. Her scoring output would be career-defining for virtually any other player in this league. And she's doing all of this while managing injury concerns that would compromise most other competitors' production. The statistical case for her MVP candidacy is not weaker than it was in her first season. It's substantially stronger. But the media apparatus that votes on these awards still operates within the same institutional framework that produced the previous outcome. This is where this stretch of the season becomes genuinely and consequentially important. When you produce numbers at this level with this consistency across multiple competitive contexts, you create a situation where media bias has to actively choose to ignore documented statistical reality rather than simply exercise reasonable judgment in an ambiguous situation. That's a far more difficult position to defend publicly, and it's substantially harder to maintain under the sustained scrutiny that an engaged and large audience applies to voting patterns and institutional decision-making. The MVP race is also inextricably connected to team outcomes in ways that individual statistics cannot fully control. Indiana will need to keep winning games for Clark's MVP campaign to fully materialize in her favor. Individual statistics exist within the context of team success at this level of award consideration. A player can produce elite numbers and still finish outside the top contention if her team doesn't win enough games. Conversely, a player on a winning team might receive consideration that slightly lower team success wouldn't generate. That's not a perfect system, but it's the system that actually governs how these awards are determined. So the MVP battlefield right now is defined by Clark's sustained excellence meeting Wilson's elite production, with the outcome ultimately depending on whether team wins align with individual statistics, whether media bias can be overcome through sustained statistical dominance, and whether the institutional apparatus that votes on these awards is prepared to acknowledge when a player has constructed a legitimate case for recognition despite previous patterns that might suggest otherwise. That's what's actually at stake in every game Clark plays between now and the end of the regular season. Understanding the media bias that has historically shaped MVP voting in the WNBA requires examining the documented pattern of how these awards have been distributed and what factors beyond pure statistical production have influenced the outcomes. This isn't a new conversation. It's a conversation that has been happening within the league for years. And it's a conversation that became impossible to ignore during Caitlin Clark's rookie season, when she produced numbers that in most historical contexts would have represented a legitimate MVP candidacy and finished fourth in voting. The first thing to understand about institutional bias is that it doesn't require conscious discrimination to produce discriminatory outcomes. It operates through systems and preferences that are embedded so deeply into how decisions are made that they often go unexamined by the people making them. In the WNBA MVP voting process, those biases have consistently influenced how media voters evaluate players, what statistical categories they weight most heavily, and what narratives they privilege when multiple players are producing at elite levels. The cumulative effect of those individual voter preferences, when aggregated across the entire voting pool, produces outcomes that reflect institutional patterns rather than objective statistical analysis. One of those patterns involves how individual statistics are contextualized within broader narratives about player roles and team needs. When a player like Aja Wilson produces 32 points per game and 12 rebounds per game, those numbers are straightforwardly celebrated as elite individual production that deserves MVP consideration. When Caitlin Clark produces 25.7 points per game while recording 9 assists per game at 53.7% shooting efficiency, there's a tendency within media discourse to compartmentalize those numbers rather than evaluate them holistically. Her scoring is good, but not as high as Wilson's. Her playmaking is elite, but assists are sometimes weighted as secondary to scoring in MVP conversations. Her shooting efficiency is exceptional, but that gets lost when the focus remains on raw point totals. This pattern of compartmentalizing rather than holistically evaluating statistics disproportionately affects players whose excellence manifests across multiple statistical categories rather than concentrating in one or two dominant areas. It's a bias that operates subtly but consistently, and it's a bias that has demonstrably shaped previous MVP voting outcomes in ways that statistical evidence alone cannot explain. When you examine how votes were distributed in previous seasons and cross-reference that with the statistical production of the candidates, you discover instances where the narrative that prevailed in media discourse didn't perfectly align with the statistical evidence that should have informed the voting. The second layer of institutional bias involves how player roles and positional considerations factor into MVP evaluation. Guards who produce scoring-heavy numbers are sometimes framed as individually dominant but potentially inefficient on a team level. Centers or forwards who produce dominant rebounding and scoring statistics are sometimes framed as benefiting from their roles and the structure of their team's offense. Those framings aren't necessarily incorrect, but they apply inconsistently depending on which player is being evaluated. This creates a situation where the same statistical production can be interpreted very differently depending on the player producing it and the pre-existing narrative that media has constructed around that player. Caitlin Clark has been subject to this kind of narrative framing throughout her professional career. Her playmaking is sometimes framed as evidence that she's not just a scorer, which is presented as positive, but it's also sometimes framed as evidence that she's distributing the workload rather than dominating games herself, which is presented as slightly less elite than a player who's scoring at higher volume. Aja Wilson's production is straightforwardly evaluated as elite dominance without the same kind of narrative complexity applied to how her statistics are contextualized within her role and her team's offensive system. The third critical factor involves how media bias operates across time and how previous voting outcomes influence subsequent voting patterns. Once a narrative is established, this player is the MVP frontrunner. That player is good but not quite at the championship level for individual awards. There's institutional inertia that makes it difficult to shift that narrative even when statistical evidence suggests the narrative should evolve. Caitlin Clark was a rookie when she finished fourth in MVP voting. That outcome created a baseline narrative about her candidacy that persists even as her statistical production has improved significantly. This is where the current stretch of the season becomes critically important from an institutional bias perspective. When a player produces numbers at an elite level with sufficient consistency across multiple weeks and multiple competitive contexts, it becomes substantially harder for media bias to simply dismiss that production through narrative framings or compartmentalization strategies. The evidence accumulates. The pattern becomes undeniable. And at a certain threshold, media bias has to actively choose to ignore statistical reality rather than simply exercise reasonable judgment in an ambiguous situation. That's a more difficult position to defend publicly. It's substantially harder to maintain when an engaged and large audience is paying attention to voting patterns and has developed a sophisticated understanding of what statistical production should logically merit consideration. When media voters can be directly asked why Clark's numbers weren't deemed sufficient for top-tier MVP consideration, while similar or lower production from other players was, the answers become harder to justify without revealing the biases operating beneath the surface. The fourth element involves understanding that media bias doesn't eliminate statistical dominance. It complicates it. It makes the path to recognition longer. It requires more sustained excellence to overcome. But sustained excellence at a sufficient level does ultimately force acknowledgement because the alternative, explicitly ignoring documented statistical reality, becomes publicly indefensible. That's where Caitlin Clark is right now. That's what this week's Player of the Week award represents in the larger context of her MVP campaign. That's why every game she plays between now and the end of the regular season matters, not just for the team's win-loss record, but for establishing a pattern so undeniable that even institutional bias has to yield to statistical evidence. During the announcement of Caitlin Clark's third Player of the Week award this season, footage captured assistant coach Brienne January's reaction to her own player receiving individual recognition. What should have been a straightforward moment of celebration became something far more complicated when observers noticed that January's visible reaction appeared less than enthusiastic about the award being publicly extended to Clark. The footage spread quickly across social media platforms where the WNBA's most engaged audience operates, and the questions it raised were immediate, serious, and difficult to dismiss as misinterpretation or overreaction to a single captured moment. Before examining what the footage appears to show and what it might reveal about organizational dynamics, it's important to establish what we can actually know with certainty and what we cannot. No one outside the Indiana Fever organization can know with absolute certainty what was occurring in Brienne January's internal state at that specific moment. She might have been thinking about something completely unrelated to the announcement. She might have been processing information from another conversation. She might have simply been captured looking in a direction that wasn't toward the announcement, and the camera angle created an unfair impression. These are all legitimate possibilities that deserve acknowledgement. What can be assessed with confidence is what the footage appears to show to observers viewing it without access to what was happening inside January's mind. That's the critical distinction between speculation about internal states and factual observation about external presentation. The footage appears to show a member of the coaching staff responding to her own player's individual recognition with visible reservation rather than visible enthusiasm. That appearance communicated something specific to the substantial and deeply engaged audience that has been watching this franchise navigate one of the most scrutinized seasons in WNBA history. The significance of this moment extends beyond the January reaction in isolation, because it exists within a broader pattern of organizational dynamics that observers have been documenting throughout this season. There have been coaching decisions that raised questions about priorities and strategic philosophy. There have been communication patterns that seem to prioritize certain messaging over others. There have been selective celebrations of certain player achievements that created perceptions about how different players were valued within the organizational hierarchy. And now there's this visible reaction to an individual award announcement that adds another data point to a pattern that's becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as a series of unconnected coincidences. The Kelsey Mitchell context matters here because it provides legitimate perspective on the January moment without dismissing the concerns it raises. Kelsey Mitchell produced 37 points in Indiana's game against Minnesota. That was an extraordinary individual performance in a single competitive context. Mitchell is also currently on a remarkable consecutive 20-point game streak that has her approaching league records in that statistical category. She needs just 2 more consecutive 20-plus point performances to pass a Ja Wilson's record, which would be a genuine and impressive individual achievement deserving of recognition and celebration. The argument that Mitchell's 37-point performance warranted consideration for Player of the Week is a reasonable sports argument that merits honest engagement. Mitchell's consecutive scoring streak is real. It's impressive. It's the kind of individual excellence that should be celebrated and appreciated. Nobody making a reasonable sports argument about Mitchell's accomplishments is making an unreasonable argument. The question is whether her single-game 37-point performance and her consecutive scoring streak constitute sufficient grounds to argue that the Player of the Week award should have gone to her instead of Clark. Clark's weekly statistics tell a different story from what a single game produces. 25.7 points per game across multiple games against multiple opponents. 53.7% shooting efficiency across multiple competitive contexts. 9 assists per game spread across the full week of competition rather than concentrated in a single game. 5 rebounds per game maintained consistently. This is sustained elite excellence across multiple games against multiple defensive schemes. Mitchell's 37 points came in one specific game against one specific opponent. Clark's weekly average came across a full competitive week where she had to reproduce excellence repeatedly against different teams with different approaches to defending her. The Player of the Week award was designed to recognize sustained excellence across multiple games rather than individual excellence in single competitive contexts. By that design standard, Clark's production across the full week clearly merited the recognition. Mitchell's supporters arguing for her deserved consideration are making a reasonable argument, but they're making an argument for a different kind of recognition than what the Player of the Week award represents. The award went to Clark because her complete weekly performance best matched what the award was designed to recognize. But here's where the January moment becomes genuinely significant in the context of the broader organizational dynamics being discussed throughout this season. When a member of the coaching staff responds to her own player's individual recognition with visible lack of enthusiasm, it raises legitimate questions about what that response communicates about the organizational environment and the culture being created around this player. It suggests, at minimum, something more complicated than full and complete organizational support for Clark's individual success and recognition. It adds credibility to the questions that have been raised about whether the environment surrounding Clark within the Fever organization is genuinely and completely aligned with celebrating her competitive excellence. This matters because elite individual performance operates within organizational context. Players perform better when they feel supported by the people surrounding them. They perform better when they know that their individual achievements will be celebrated rather than met with reservation by the coaching staff. They perform better when the organizational culture creates an environment where success is collectively valued rather than selectively celebrated depending on which player achieves it. The January moment, whether it reveals something genuinely troubling or simply represents a misread isolated incident, has become a symbol for a larger conversation about what the Indiana Fever organization is actually communicating through its actions and reactions about how it values Clark's success. Kelsey Mitchell's consecutive 20-point game streak deserves its own honest examination, separate from the Clark MVP conversation, because Mitchell's individual excellence is real and impressive and shouldn't be diminished simply because it exists in the same season as Clark's more historically significant achievement. This is where it becomes important to separate conversations rather than conflating them, and to acknowledge when multiple players are producing at genuinely elite levels without treating recognition of one player's excellence as an implicit dismissal of another player's accomplishment. Mitchell is currently on a remarkable run of scoring consistency. She's recorded 20-plus points in multiple consecutive games, and she's on a trajectory that puts her in range of Ja Wilson's league record for consecutive games with 20 or more points. She needs just 2 more consecutive 20-plus point performances to pass that record, which would represent a genuine and historically significant individual achievement that deserves recognition and celebration. The record stands because maintaining that level of scoring consistency across multiple games against multiple opponents is difficult. The fact that Mitchell is approaching it means she's operating at an elite level of individual performance. The 37-point game against Minnesota that some have argued should have won Player of the Week was an extraordinary performance in the specific context where it occurred. 37 points against a single opponent represents the kind of offensive explosion that basketball audiences come to professional games to witness. It's a performance that deserves to be celebrated for what it was, an exceptional display of scoring ability in a particular competitive situation. But, and this is critical, it's also a single-game performance concentrated in one specific competitive context rather than distributed across a full week of multiple games and multiple opponents. The distinction between what Mitchell accomplished in that single game and what Clark accomplished across a full competitive week is important for understanding how award voting should work. Mitchell proved she could score 37 points in one game. That's undeniably impressive. Clark proved she could average 25.7 points per game across multiple games while shooting 53.7% from the field and recording 9 assists per game. Those are different kinds of accomplishment, and they deserve different kinds of recognition corresponding to what they represent. Mitchell's consecutive 20-point streak is the kind of achievement that deserves recognition because it demonstrates consistency. It's not just one spectacular game. It's multiple games where she's maintained a high level of scoring output. That's valuable because consistency across multiple competitive contexts is harder to achieve than excellence in a single game. Mitchell is demonstrating that she can produce at an elite level repeatedly, which is genuinely impressive and genuinely worth celebrating. If Mitchell extends that streak by 2 more games and breaks Wilson's consecutive 20-point record, that will be a legitimate individual achievement that merits media attention and league recognition. But here's the complicated part that makes the Clark versus Mitchell comparison genuinely interesting rather than straightforward. Mitchell's streak represents elite scoring consistency. Clark's week represents elite comprehensive excellence that includes scoring, playmaking, efficiency, and production across multiple statistical categories. Mitchell is excelling in one primary area, scoring, and excelling at a very high level. Clark is operating at elite level across multiple dimensions of the game simultaneously. The Player of the Week award was designed to recognize sustained comprehensive excellence rather than sustained excellence concentrated in a single statistical category. This is where it becomes important to acknowledge that both conversations can be true simultaneously. Mitchell's consecutive scoring streak is impressive and deserves recognition. The Player of the Week award going to Clark is the correct decision based on what the award was designed to recognize. These two statements don't contradict each other. They can coexist. Mitchell's supporters arguing that her 37-point performance warranted serious consideration are making a reasonable sports argument. The counterargument that Clark's comprehensive weekly production better matched what Player of the Week recognizes is also a reasonable sports argument. Both can be true. The real issue that the January moment raised wasn't about whether Mitchell deserved consideration. It was about what the coaching staff's visible reaction communicated about the organizational environment and whether there's genuine, complete, and enthusiastic support for Clark's individual recognition when she achieves it. If January's reaction reflected disappointment that Mitchell didn't win instead of Clark, that's one kind of organizational dynamic that raises specific questions. If it reflected something else entirely, that would change the meaning of the moment. But the reality is that we don't know with certainty what was occurring internally, and that uncertainty itself becomes part of the larger conversation about what this franchise is communicating through its visible actions and reactions. Mitchell's consecutive 20-point streak will either extend to a record-breaking achievement or it won't. That outcome will be determined by her own performance and her team's offensive execution across the remaining games of the season. Her achievement doesn't require Mitchell to diminish Clark's accomplishment or to compete for recognition as though there's a limited supply of it. Individual excellence in professional basketball is not zero-sum. Multiple players can be operating at elite levels in different ways simultaneously, and the league can and should celebrate all of them without treating recognition of one player as an implicit dismissal of another. The Mitchell angle becomes genuinely significant only when it's connected to broader questions about how the Fever organization is responding to individual player excellence, and whether that response is consistent and enthusiastic regardless of which player is receiving recognition. If the franchise celebrates Mitchell's consecutive scoring streak with the same visible enthusiasm it shows for other players' achievements, then the January moment becomes genuinely difficult to interpret as anything other than an isolated incident or a misread of what was actually happening. If the franchise's response to individual achievements shows patterns of selective enthusiasm based on which player is being recognized, then the January moment becomes another data point in a larger pattern of organizational inconsistency about how it values different players' success. The broader implications of the Brienne January moment and the Player of the Week controversy connect directly to a conversation that has been ongoing throughout this season about the internal organizational dynamics of the Indiana Fever and whether the environment genuinely and completely supports Caitlin Clark's competitive success and her individual recognition within the league. This isn't a new conversation. It's a conversation that's been building throughout the entire season as observers have documented coaching decisions, communication patterns, and organizational behaviors that have raised persistent questions about the alignment between what the franchise says publicly about Clark and what its actual decisions and reactions reveal about what's actually driving the culture surrounding her. Throughout this season, there have been moments that have triggered questions about whether coaching decisions were optimizing for Clark's individual success or whether they reflected different priorities. There have been instances where communication patterns seem to emphasize certain narratives about the team or certain players while de-emphasizing others. There have been moments where the organizational celebration of particular player achievements seemed more enthusiastic than the celebration of other achievements. These individual moments in isolation might not constitute a pattern. But when they accumulate across an entire season, when they're documented by multiple observers paying close attention to the franchise, and when they start pointing consistently in a particular direction, they create a situation where the questions about organizational culture become substantially harder to dismiss as individual coincidences unconnected to each other. The January footage adds a data point to this larger conversation that will be difficult to dismiss simply, because the precise internal meaning of the reaction cannot be confirmed from outside the organization. That inability to know with certainty what January was thinking or feeling doesn't diminish the significance of how the reaction appeared or what it seemed to communicate to the audience observing it. What matters is that multiple people watching the footage interpreted it similarly, that the interpretation seemed consistent with other concerns that had been raised throughout the season about the organizational environment. and that the moment therefore fit into a larger pattern rather than standing in contradiction to it. Consider the specific expectations that attach to a coaching staff's reaction when one of their own players receives individual recognition at a significant level. The expectation that any member of the Indiana Fever coaching staff would respond to a Clark Player of the Week announcement with visible and genuine enthusiasm is completely reasonable. This is a player who has already broken multiple WNBA records. This is a player whose presence on the team has elevated the entire franchise's profile and competitive standing within the league. This is a player whose individual excellence is directly connected to the franchise's playoff prospects and overall competitive success. The baseline expectation is that coaching staff members would celebrate that recognition visibly and genuinely, because that's what the organizational environment typically communicates about valuing individual player excellence. When coaching decisions, communication patterns, selective organizational celebrations, and now visible reactions to individual recognition all appear to point in a consistent direction, the questions about organizational culture become substantially harder to dismiss as individual coincidences unconnected to each other. Pattern recognition is a legitimate analytical tool. When multiple data points accumulate, and they seem to cluster around similar themes, it's not unreasonable to ask whether those clusters reflect something actually occurring within the organization, rather than merely coincidental individual moments that happen to be interpreted similarly. The complicating factor is that organizational culture is difficult to assess from outside an organization. Observers don't have access to private conversations. They don't know what's being discussed in coaching meetings. They don't understand the full context of every decision that gets made. But organizational culture also manifests in visible ways through decisions that get made publicly, through communication patterns that get documented, through reactions that get captured on camera, and through patterns of behavior that accumulate over time and create impressions about what's actually valued within the organization, despite what official statements claim. This season has been genuinely difficult for the Indiana Fever from a cultural perspective. Bringing in a generational talent like Caitlin Clark creates both opportunities and challenges. It creates an expectation that the entire organization should be structured around optimizing for that player's success. It creates scrutiny that applies to every decision, every communication, every visible reaction. It creates a situation where the franchise is being evaluated not just on its competitive outcomes, but on whether it's creating the kind of organizational environment that would genuinely support a player of Clark's caliber and potential. Some of that scrutiny might be unfair. Some of it might be based on misinterpretations or selective readings of events. Some of it might reflect the bias of observers who have particular opinions about how the franchise should be operating. But the reality is that the scrutiny exists, that it's being applied consistently by engaged observers paying close attention to the franchise, and that the organization's actual decisions and visible reactions either validate or dismiss the concerns being raised. The January moment, in that context, becomes significant not because it proves anything definitively, but because it fits into a larger pattern that has been developing throughout the season. What becomes clear as this season unfolds is that the Indiana Fever organization cannot control how observers interpret individual moments, but it can control whether its overall pattern of decisions, communications, and visible support for Clark's excellence provides evidence that dismisses the concerns being raised or validates them. Every game moving forward, every coaching decision, every visible reaction to Clark's individual achievements will be part of that larger evaluation of organizational culture. The culture isn't created by single moments. It's created by patterns of behavior that accumulate and eventually tell a clear story about what an organization actually values beneath the surface of its public statements and official positions. The convergence of elite individual statistics, an active MVP campaign, institutional questions about organizational culture, and the specific moment we've been examining creates a situation in professional basketball where multiple consequential issues have come together simultaneously. Understanding what's actually at stake requires stepping back from individual components and looking at the complete picture of what's happening with Caitlin Clark's season, Indiana's competitive standing, and what this moment represents for how the WNBA evaluates and recognizes individual excellence going forward. At the most immediate level, Caitlin Clark is competing in a legitimate MVP race. The statistics make that statement on their own without requiring advocacy or narrative construction. 25.7 points per game, 53.7% shooting efficiency, 9 assists per game, 5 rebounds per game. These aren't numbers that require creative interpretation to justify consideration for the highest individual honor in professional basketball. These are numbers that on their face represent elite excellence and sustained production at a level that would constitute a legitimate MVP candidacy in most years of this league's history. The fact that they might not be sufficient this year isn't because the numbers are insufficient. It's because they're being evaluated against Ja Wilson's equally elite production in a context where institutional biases and voting patterns might weight the vote in ways that pure statistical comparison might not justify. What Clark does between now and the end of the regular season has direct bearing on how she finishes in MVP voting. Every game she plays represents an opportunity to either strengthen her statistical case through continued excellence or to weaken it through a decline in performance. The threshold for MVP consideration at this level is extremely high, and maintaining elite excellence across an extended stretch of the season is substantially more difficult than producing elite numbers for a short period. Clark has already demonstrated that she can maintain this level for multiple weeks. The question now is whether she can sustain it through the final stretch of the regular season as physical fatigue becomes a factor, as opposing teams have more time to study and potentially adjust defensive schemes, and as the emotional and mental demands of competing at this level accumulate across an extended period. Indiana's record matters directly to this equation. Individual statistics exist within the context of team success in MVP voting. A player can produce numbers that are statistically elite and still finish outside the final MVP consideration if her team doesn't win enough games to make those numbers seem consequential for competitive success. Conversely, a player on a winning team might receive consideration that slightly lower team success wouldn't generate. That's not a perfect system, and it's not ideally structured to reward pure individual excellence. But it's the system that actually governs these awards, and it matters. Indiana needs to keep winning games. The team's record down the final stretch of the season will either amplify or significantly diminish the statistical case Clark is building week by week. But the stakes extend substantially beyond MVP voting, because what happens in the Clark MVP narrative this season has implications for how the WNBA values and recognizes individual excellence going forward. If Clark produces sustained elite statistics and Indiana finishes with a competitive record, but she still finishes outside the top positions in MVP voting, that sends a specific message about what kind of production is considered sufficient for MVP recognition in this league. It suggests that elite efficiency and playmaking are weighted as secondary to high-volume scoring. It suggests that institutional biases can, in fact, overcome statistical dominance. It suggests that the voting patterns established in Clark's rookie season are the patterns that will persist regardless of how her production improves or what records she breaks. The organizational culture, questions that the January moment raised have broader stakes, as well because they connect to how the WNBA is currently thinking about the environment surrounding its most talented players. Is the league committed to creating organizational cultures where elite individual excellence is genuinely celebrated and supported? Or are there corners of the league where talented players operate in environments where their individual recognition receives mixed signals? The Fever's internal dynamics matter for Caitlin Clark's individual success, but they also matter for what they communicate about standards for organizational excellence and whether the league is genuinely committed to supporting its most talented players in ways that extend beyond on-court production. The historical context makes this moment genuinely significant for the WNBA as an institution. Caitlin Clark is on a trajectory that could redefine what's possible in this league. She's already broken records that stood for years. She's already established herself as a player operating at a historical level. And she's doing all of this in her second season of professional play, which means there's potentially decades of career ahead where she could continue accumulating achievements and records. How the league responds to her MVP candidacy, how the media votes on individual awards, and whether the institutional apparatus supports her success all become part of the story of how the WNBA handles the emergence of transformational individual talent. What's at stake for Caitlin Clark personally is the possibility of finally receiving the individual recognition that statistical excellence should generate despite whatever biases exist within the voting system. What's at stake for Indiana is whether the franchise can capitalize on the opportunity to compete for championships with a historically talented player operating at her peak. What's at stake for the WNBA is whether the institution is prepared to honestly evaluate and recognize excellence when it emerges, or whether documented biases and established patterns will continue to shape awards and recognition in ways that don't perfectly align with statistical reality. These are genuinely significant stakes, and they're all converging on the remaining games of this season. The numbers don't lie. Caitlin Clark has won Player of the Week for the third time this season. She's averaging 25.7 points, shooting 53.7% from the field, recording 9 assists per game, and constructing a statistical case for MVP consideration that forces honest reckoning with what's actually happening on the basketball court. But the numbers exist within a context that extends far beyond what the statistics alone can communicate. That context includes institutional biases that have shaped previous voting patterns. It includes questions about organizational culture that an assistant coach's visible reaction crystallized. It includes the reality that media bias, once it establishes a pattern, is difficult to overcome without overwhelming statistical evidence. The remainder of this season will determine whether Clark's sustained excellence reaches the threshold where it becomes impossible to ignore, or whether institutional preferences find ways to diminish her candidacy despite the statistical evidence supporting it. Indiana needs to keep winning. Clark needs to keep producing at this level. The organizational environment needs to demonstrate genuine, consistent support for her success. And the media will need to make a choice about whether it's prepared to honestly evaluate her production, or whether documented biases will continue to shape how individual excellence is recognized in professional basketball. The MVP conversation is real. The implications extend far beyond this season, and everything accumulated so far points toward a reckoning that's becoming increasingly difficult to avoid.